For the facing sample, you're going to need your pattern, your instruction sheet, as well as your material. We're going to start with the pattern. Please cut the pattern out and take a look that it says place on fold. Some of the material was not cut long enough, so what we'll do instead is we'll cut out our facing sample first, placing it here, and then we'll place our bodice front. The part that's really important is this part here. So if we cut a little bit off on the bottom of the bodice, that's fine as well. But we'll cut this one out first, and then we'll pin and cut this part out. Now we've cut out our pieces, we're ready to unstitch it and start with our beginning part. For the purpose of the demonstration, I'm going to use a different color facing. This is the part that's going to be attached to here and then flip to the other side, so it's going to be easier for you to follow. So there's my facing, and here is my bodice. So step number 1 is to pin the facing and the neckline, matching the notches at end points. So a straight stitch at a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance from end to end, and back stitch at each end. Right side to right side. My setting's at a 5, a 2.5. Now I'm ready to sew. The next set of instructions say to grade your seam allowance to half the width on the facing only. Grading is to trim your seam allowances to various levels, making layers of the fabric a different width. This helps reduce the bulk. So here's our facing, and this is the seam allowance for our facing. And the reason why we want to trim this one is all of this is going to get tucked over underneath to the other side. And we want to reduce the amount of bulk that's going to happen here. So you're going to take your scissors and just trim half of it. Only the facing. It says we're going to clip the seam allowance where it curves. Clipping is cutting straight into the seam allowance to just before the stitching line. So there's my seam, and these little dots all indicate my clips. It releases the curve, allowing the curve to sit flat when the facing is turned to the wrong side. So if I turn this now to the wrong side, what happens is my curve isn't able to lie straight because I've got all this material and it needs to get released. So you're going to take your scissors, and right where the curve is, you need to clip it. Just to the seam allowance. Do not cut your stitches. Next it says, press the seam allowance towards the facing. So now I'm going to go to the ironing board, and I'm going to press from the wrong side my seam allowance all the way towards my facing. The part that's important is that this seam here stays nice and crisp. Remember, crisp means to keep it open. You don't want to press it where this facing is stuck underneath. So everything has to get nice and crisp and open. So I'm going to pull my facing out, and I'm going to press my seam. Okay, pull the facing out and press that seam. So you're constantly pulling this guy out. Okay. Once I've pressed it from the wrong side, go ahead and press it from the right side, continuing to keep your pressing up. And this is where you can double check to make sure your seams, which are right in here, are nice and crisp. So now we're going to understitch through the facing and both seam allowances only, close to the seam line. Stitch with a straight stitch at a 0A 2.5 using the center of the presser foot as your guide along the seam. Make sure the seam stays crisp as you sew. Understitching is stitching a line close to the edge of the facing to keep it from rolling up. So here's our diagram again. This is our facing, and that's the stitching line that we're going to be using. So I've set my machine to a 0A 2.5. So now I'm ready for my understitching. I'm going to stitch the facing as well as my seam allowances together. I'm going to line up the center of the presser foot right along my seam, having the facing to the left-hand side. Make sure you backstitch in the beginning and backstitch at the end, and that your seam stays nice and crisp. You're pulling that out. So here's my understitching. It's along my facing, and it's also taking all of my seam allowances in. The next step says we're going to press this facing towards the wrong side of the garment. The understitching should allow the facing not to roll up and out of the garment. I'm going to now push all of this to the wrong side. You're going to fold it over, and what you really want to pay particular attention to is that this seam is nice and crisp and that the folded is right along that edge. So now I've pressed it under, and you can see that it's staying there, and you're going to take a look and make sure that that edge is nice and crisp. Fold it over to the other side, give it one more press, and now you have the front of your bodice with your facing on the other side. It gives you a nice clean finish at the top, and the facing with the understitching is preventing that from coming up and out. So this is exactly the same method that you're going to do for your waistband of your skirt. However, you're going to interface your facing on the wrong side before you attach it.